everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be learning about why your shoes don't fit and hopefully learning a little bit about our feet as well, because they are incredibly complex and yet we learn so little about them usually. So I am a shoemaker and I specifically work with historical shoemaking, meaning that I have spent years looking at hundreds and hundreds of years of shoes and trying to understand how they were made in different centuries for different reasons, how they dealt with different foot problems, and how common those issues were varies across the centuries because of the different techniques that they were using for shoemaking. Now, from the 19th century forward, a lot of things in shoemaking started to change because we were looking towards mass manufacture as the ideal way of making shoes, meaning that as we went along, how we made shoes, what they were made up of, and how they were constructed was really affected by the type of machinery that we were using. They wanted a really easy, consistent product that was preferably pretty cheap. So shoemaking has changed over the years, not to make shoes necessarily more comfortable in most cases, but to make them easier and more consistent in their production, which often means that our shoes aren't doing enough for us because we demand so much of them. Our feet are not meant for the modern surfaces that we walk on every day. They are engineered, in a sense, to work on sand and dirt and grass, uneven surfaces that have some shock absorption. Instead, today we walk on cement and concrete, and that really doesn't. So our shoes need to make up the difference in order to keep our feet from having a lot of problems. And on top of that, our feet are incredibly complex and unique. So there are so many moving parts in them. They actually have 26 bones in each foot, which makes up together a quarter of the bones in your body. There are also 29 muscles in each foot, so your feet can be flexible or strong, just like the rest of the muscles in your body. So there's a wide variance in the way that your feet are built and the way that they're conditioned. That means that they're not going to be the same for every person, they're not going to be the same throughout your life, and they're not even going to be the same from morning till night. Our feet often swell as we go about our day, and for some people that's a really big difference. These are all things that we have to keep into account when we start talking about the idea of the perfect shoes. That's one of the questions that I always get: what's the best shoe? What shoe should I buy? And the answer is, that depends on your feet, that depends on what you're wearing them for, what surfaces you're wearing them on, what you need them to do medically. So there's not one answer even for one person. Honestly, it's better if you don't just wear the same pair of shoes all the time, because if there's something that's not quite right about that one pair of shoes, it's just gonna get amplified. If something's being underworked or overworked, it's a lot. So in many ways, you don't want one perfect pair. You want a lot of pairs that work for you, and those are the tools that we're going to be talking about today. All of the different ways that shoes can mistreat your feet, and all the things you can start to look out for that might be good for you or bad for you. Now, none of this, I want to note, is medical advice. I cannot, because I am not a doctor, advise on medical problems with your feet. If you have issues that won't just go away if you stop wearing that pair of shoes, that is something you go see a doctor for. This is more an issue of, why do I get blisters when I wear this type of shoe? Why are my feet so tired when I wear this type of high heel? Questions that come down to how our feet differ from each other's. Because in the end, no matter how nice a pair of shoes looks, if they're not comfortable, you're not going to wear them. And that's just a big waste. So we want to make sure that we're buying shoes that are going to be as comfortable for us as possible. We'll go about our days putting so much time and effort into making sure that we're comfortable in so many other ways. Our desk chair, for example, we put so much time and energy into making sure that we have a comfortable desk chair that doesn't hurt our back. We also know that we need to put a bunch of time and effort into making sure that we have a mattress that also works for us, which is one of the reasons why I'm so happy that today's sponsor is Birch. Thanks, Birch, for sponsoring today's video. Their Memorial Day sale is live now, so head to the link in my description to learn more, because the time we spend off our feet is just as important for our body. Birch makes mattresses crafted with organic and natural materials that have been sustainably sourced. I've been doing a thorough spring cleaning around the house, and oof. It's always important to look for any way to reduce allergens and toxins year-round, though. Birch mattresses are crafted with organic and natural materials that have been sustainably sourced, and they're free from polyurethane foams and fiberglass, so no off-gassing or irritants. The Birch Luxe Natural mattress even includes 8 different layers of organic cashmere, New Zealand wool, fair trade cotton, and 100% natural latex. And by having wool in these mattresses instead of synthetics, it makes them both allergen and mildew resistant. I've been sleeping on my Birch mattress now for over 2 years, and I absolutely love it. I fall asleep fast and wake up without an aching body or all of the allergy sniffles that I constantly had. And now I've added one to my guest room too, which I definitely appreciate since this is also my office. And you don't have to worry about trying it out. With your Birch mattress, you get a 100-night sleep trial along with a 25-year warranty. That means you'll get more than 3 months to make sure that you love it. The best part about all of this is that Birch delivers your mattress right to your door for free within the US. They also offer in-home setup and removal to make your buying experience as convenient as possible. Each Birch mattress comes with 2 of their eco-rest pillows made from recycled materials. They're breathable and better for the environment. I love my Birch mattress and I think you would too. If you're looking for a new bed, check out Birch Living. Their Memorial Day sale is live now. It's the perfect time to upgrade your sleep with 20% off of a Birch mattress, plus 2 free eco-rest pillows. Visit birchliving.com/Nicole Rudolph to find out more about this limited time offer. Thanks again to Birch for sponsoring this week's video, so that way I can be comfortable both on and off of my feet. Now on to the important stuff that we need to get to know about your feet. I highly recommend, if you get a chance to do it before watching this or after watching it and coming back to rewatch it, is to take a tracing of your foot. We don't need a bunch of measurements and complicated stuff for this. We're not building a custom pair of shoes. Instead, this is just a simple tracing, putting your foot flat on a hard surface on a sheet of paper and tracing your foot. I like to do it twice over, once with the pencil up and down and once with it tilted inwards so I can actually see what my real footprint is, because not all of my foot touches the ground. And that gives me a good idea of what foot shape and proportions I'm dealing with. Because usually the only thing that we learn about our foot is our length and maybe our width. And that's it. It's just the length and width of our footprint, and somehow that's supposed to tell you your size. When our foot is a 3-dimensional moving object, and it has a lot of dynamic parts to it, especially since things like sizes have such a slight difference between them, and most people wear multiple sizes for that reason. We end up with different widths for different styles of shoes because not all shoes are made with the same widths. Athletic shoes are actually on a whole different sizing system when it comes to widths. Same thing with men's and women's shoes, different widths. So it's all very complex, and that's why it's important to get to know your feet. So this is the tracing of my foot. Don't judge yours based off of mine. Mine are as weird as anyone else's. They are not in the middle or average in any way. What's important here is that you can see roughly where the widest point of the foot is, the ball of the foot. When I'm taking measurements for shoemaking, I'll measure around the circumference because the circumference is way more important than the actual width. Some people are really wide and flat across the ball of their foot, and some people are really narrow and high. So they can have the same circumference with a very different footprint. And so it's more important to understand the overall width. It's also important to understand just how squishy that part of your foot can be, because that is a part of your foot that is not hard and solid. And actually for some people, it spreads a lot when you stand up. And there are other measurements that I take as well moving up the foot. When we move towards, say, the instep area, that's an area that does not squish at all. So that's a really important measurement when I'm dealing with custom shoes. But for most of what we're talking about today, I just want you to focus on that placement of the ball of your foot, that widest point. The first thing I want to talk about is proportions, because though we get an overall length of our foot that tells us our supposed size, you may find that your foot slips forward or your toes get really cramped or all sorts of issues that combine when it comes to length that mean that you have to go up or down, and sometimes you'll find it just doesn't fit right no matter what size you're choosing. Well, that's because of their proportions. Just like some people have really long or really short legs and the torso makes up the difference, our feet have the same issues with proportions. Where the widest part of your foot is may not be proportionally in the same place. So you can have really long or really short toes. It's the easiest way to think about it. So if we're dealing with this as our midway point of a foot, and we draw a shoe sole that works with this, what happens if our toes are longer and we move the widest part back a little bit? Well, now all of a sudden our foot's not going to fit because the shoe narrows so much very abruptly. So what's going to happen is we slide the foot forward into the shoe, the toes will get cramped, and the heel will have a space in the back. And it's going to feel like the shoe doesn't fit both ways. If there are shorter toes, then the widest part of the foot is actually going to be forward where the toe area is actually already narrowing. And that causes just as many issues because you can't slide further back into the shoe. It just ends up feeling like the shoe is too narrow for you, even if it's bigger than your footprint. So both of those can cause problems in flats and similar problems in heels. So with a high heel, if you have longer toes, you're going to find that you still slide forward, same sort of issue. But if you have shorter toes, you're going to find that your arch is wholly unsupported. You're basically just not touching the shoe aside from the very back and the very front portion. So the solutions for both of these are going to be different. If you're just dealing with the gap under the arch, there are lots of different cushions that can fit under that gap. There's even this brand that specifically sells a cushion that you put in your shoe that's supposed to make high heels more comfortable. And this is what it's doing, supporting that gap underneath your arch, which might come from your foot proportions, or it might come from the fact that sometimes high heels don't have the curve that's needed in order to fit with your foot. That is really straight, so that kind of fills in the space and supports underneath the whole foot, which distributes your weight better. In the case of the foot that's sliding forward, well, then you can put a cushion underneath the ball of the foot, or even toe spacers can kind of help keep you seated back into the shoe. So there are lots of different cushions and ways that you can manage this, but knowing that your proportions might be different than a shoe's expected proportions can really start to help you understand why things feel like they don't fit lengthwise or widthwise in certain situations. Now, of course, there's a lot more to width than that. Many people have wider feet than is considered average, and I don't mean that in the actual average of people's feet. I mean that in terms of what the shoemaking industry has decided is the B width for women and the D width for men, and that is what we are going with. It's not going to cover most people, and we have so few options out there when it comes to a variety of widths in shoes. There are a few brands that sell wider styles or narrower styles, but it's increasingly rare. And again, this is really important to think about it in that circumference, not just in the width of your foot taken by a footprint. So think about your foot as a three-dimensional object and know that stretching the shoe can sometimes work, but there's a lot of other things that you can make good decisions on the rest of the way through this video that hopefully will help alleviate some of those problems in other ways too. For example, toe shapes. I grew up hearing that pointed toes were absolutely horrible and so uncomfortable, but when I started wearing high heels and lots of more adult styles of shoes, I found that those actually were much more comfortable for me than the rounded toes that everyone was always talking about being the best option. So I never understood why that was the case. Well, it turns out there's an element of our foot shape that I never hear talked about anymore. And while you may have seen those diagrams that are what type of toe do you have, basically which toe is your longest and what proportions do you have, that's one element to this. But there actually is an entire tilt to your foot. So for some people, they have very straight, symmetrical feet. Others will have almost a curve to their feet, and their toes will angle in or out sometimes, depending on how the bone length is set up. So in my case, I have a very symmetrical foot, meaning that I don't have a really strong curve to the inside. Because of the way my little toe sticks out, I might actually have a bit of a curve to the outside, more so than anything. So I constantly have blisters and problems with that little toe on the outside, because a lot of shoes today are built to be really swooped inwards, very distinctly right and left, in order to give you enough space for your biggest toe. And for many people, that's great. For me, that doesn't work that way. So I find it actually more comfortable to wear the older style of straight last shoes where we don't have right and left and they're symmetrical. I find that much more comfortable because it gives me space for my toes. So you might find in looking at your footprint that they tilt inwards or outwards, that one of your toes or a different part of your foot sticks out prominently, and that's something you need to keep in mind when you are looking at different toe shapes and the silhouette of the bottom of the shoe. Some shoes are much more straight and others are much more curved and tilted inwards. And that's going to save you a lot of stress just by being able to look at the way that your foot compares to the sole of the shoe. For me, that means the reason why the pointed toes work better for me is that a lot of times that extended length in order to get a pointed toe, whereas most rounded toes might only need to be about 2/3 of an inch longer than your foot, pointed toes can be an inch, 2 inch, or even more extra space beyond the toes of your foot, means that I'm more likely to have a little bit of extension space for my little toe. It's just simply a balance and proportion thing, and knowing where the fullness lies beyond the widest part of your foot and the space that you need, especially since pointed toes tend to narrow down from a vertical sense as well. So if someone needs a lot of space for their bigger toe, which is the tallest one, then pointed toes might be an issue for you because that's cutting off your vertical space that you need. Knowing that difference when you're looking at different toe shapes means that some are going to be more comfortable for you inherently than others, but that is distinct to your feet. Next, we're going to move up the foot a little bit to the arch support area. Now, I already talked about this a little bit when we talked about proportions and how if you've got shorter toes, you might find your foot wholly unsupported when it comes to higher heels. This is a bigger, broader issue for some people. Your foot can trend towards a flatter arch or higher arch. We've probably all heard of flat feet before. What generally happens there is because the muscles aren't able to hold the arch of the foot up and together for various reasons, it starts to collapse and you might end up having to angle your ankles or your feet in order to compensate for this. Same thing goes with the higher arch. They find that there's there's a lot of compensation that goes into the ankle and rolling that back and forth in order to manage both of those things. Now, there are lots of medical reasons why these can happen and lots of medical treatments for these that I'm not going to get into, but it's important to know that arch support is not necessarily a universal fix, in the fact that it doesn't make up for having weak muscles in your feet or other medical issues. So while yes, you do want to make sure that you are spreading out the pressure on your feet as much as possible, so that way you are making proper contact with the ground, and for some people, their footprint just doesn't make as much contact as it should, and just because there's not a lot of built up cushioning in the shoe doesn't mean that it won't work for your foot. In fact, a lot of that cushioning is there because the shoe itself is really stiff, and so they make up for that stiffness and the fact that it's not going to accommodate and shift and flex with your foot by putting in a bunch of padding that makes it feel okay that your shoe is fighting against you. So historically, they didn't have arch support built into shoes in the same way because shoes were much more flexible. In fact, you look at a lot of women's heels of, say, the 19th or 18th century, and they're incredibly lightweight. And so they actually end up molding to the foot and flexing and moving in order to encourage muscle strength there and making sure that everything feels supported the whole way through. So instead of padding it up and building it into a stiff structure, there's flexibility. So there's not one right answer in this. It's more accommodating whatever sort of shoe you end up with, and the stiffness versus the flexibility is a big part of that. You also might notice gaps along the sides of your feet or rubbing along the sides of your feet. So when I talked about before that we might have a very linear or a curved foot, if you have a really curved foot, you might notice that, say, the outside of your foot at the midpoint is rubbing up against the outside of the shoe where the seam or the edge is. So that's an area that you want to watch on shoes to make sure that it's not really rigid in that area, or there's a seam or a decorative piece that's going to rub and cause problems there. Same thing goes with the gaps that, yes, can be filled by padding in order to cover the arch support, but in both cases, if you don't necessarily need it and the gaps or the rubbing are causing issues, then looking for things like open sides might be a better option. That's one of the reasons why those are so commonly offered, because then you don't necessarily have to deal with that region not fitting correctly. Because just like the front of our foot can be wide and flat or really narrow and tall, as we move further back up the foot, we can also get into a more rounded shape or a more triangular shape. So sometimes there are going to be gaps in different places, and there's no place that is more obvious about this than in the heel area. So if you look at just the very back of someone's heel area, you can see a bit of a triangular shape there, but sometimes it's a bit more concave and sometimes it's a bit more convex. So this is where those heel slips really start to be a problem. You might have already noticed them because of the proportions and sliding forward in the shoe, but this is an area where shoes are built with a really stiff heel cup in order to keep the shoe rigid and proportioned correctly and not collapsing every single time you put your foot in. But that means that they have to average it towards a bigger heel area, because if they scoop it out, give it a really concave shape, it's not going to fit on a lot of people. So what they do instead is they give it a very rounded shape, which is beyond what most feet are, and then it sort of cups in at the top where it holds your foot into place theoretically, but it's a very sharp edge, usually, at least in my opinion, that holds that foot into place. So if you have a narrow heel, and mind you that a narrow heel or a wide heel is not going to necessarily correspond with a narrow or a wide foot in front. So you can have a very narrow heel and very wide ball of the foot. It doesn't necessarily correspond, and heel slippage very often will come from either the heels that are much more narrow or the ones that have that more concave shape that allows them to slip upwards really easily. And you can add padding into the back of this heel area to help with that. You can also look for shoes that aren't quite as rigid back there or have quite as distinct of a hard line at the top. You can also make sure, very importantly, I think for everyone, that it doesn't have extra little decorative things back there. Sometimes there are pulls at the backs of shoes that are functional, but in a lot of cases when they're lower shoes and not boots, they're there for decorative purposes, and sometimes they have some really harsh edges in that area and a lot of extra stitching, which means that that's just going to rub up against your foot. So keep an eye out for what the seams and the edges are doing in that area, how stiff it is, how wide it is, how hard and rigid the edge of the shoe is, and how much that's going to fight back. Because a lot of modern shoes have very stiff soles, meaning that you're going to flip-flop your way around no matter what you do. They're not going to bend with you. So So you're going to lift your heel up and off of the sole no matter what you do, meaning that anything in back will rub on your foot if it's anywhere near your heel. So sometimes it's better to have as little as possible back there and as much room as possible rather than trying to attempt to grip it down to your foot when the sole won't actually flex with it. If it's a stiff shoe, the back's going to be a problem no matter what, as long as there's anything back there that is rigid. Now, there's additional pressure points in that area as well that I want to go over. So first up, we have the major pressure point of the instep, which is on top of the foot. There's a little pointy bone right there, and for some people it is very pronounced, which means that it is very sensitive. You can also have a high or low instep, so your foot can be more flat and rounded, or it can be very high and triangular. So you might find if you have a high instep that boots or Oxfords or other things that lace over your foot end up feeling too tight pretty often, and you get a lot of rubbing in that area and soreness on top of the foot when you have closed shoes. And if you have a really low instep, you might find that no matter how tightly you lace those shoes, it's never going to actually hold your foot in place and it will continue to slip. So understanding if you have a really high or really low instep, closed shoes might be a consistent problem for you, and that's definitely something you need to plan ahead for, because there's not really an easy way to cushion or open up the tops necessarily. So it's just something to be aware of, that open styles might be more comfortable for you, or shoes that have extra elastic and extra gussets or extra flexibility or softer uppers might do better in that region in order to give you a wider range of circumference around that area. Now, if you're dealing with the opposite side of this whole issue and you're struggling with open styles of shoes, that might be a case of a foot being on the squishier side, because feet are relatively squishy for everybody. Some people just have looser or squishier feet. That's really common. And you might find when you are wearing open shoes like pumps or sandals that things start to cut in around the edges, maybe things start to squish out over those edges and it gets even worse. And so this is a case where you want to be aware of the edges you're putting on your shoes. So higher shoes, boots, and Oxfords closed up might do better for your feet than the open styles or really strappy styles. But if you feel like you need or want to wear those for whatever reason, then looking for things that are, again, much more elastic, softer edges, stretchier leathers, stretchier knit fabrics around the edge instead of hard stitched leather or plastic edges will be much friendlier to you. So look for things that are elasticated in different ways in all of these cases when it comes to the uppers. Another note before we move out of the points that we need to pay attention to is in the back area at your ankle points. So those two bones on either side that are sticking out and very sensitive. If you're wearing a pair of shoes that doesn't go up over the ankle, you need to make sure that they sit low enough to not rub on those. I have particularly low ankle points, so I am aware of that being an issue when I go to try on and purchase shoes and try them out for the first time. I'm also aware of where the shoe hits me at the very back of my foot in the heel area, because that can feel too high or too low, which can, again, if it's too low, lead to slippage. If it's too high, it's going to be pressing into the back of your Achilles tendon and cause problems there. So everyone has different proportions in that region as well. Just make note of where the shoes hit you in that area, because it is so very sensitive. And so when it comes down to it, a lot of the problems that we end up with our shoes, outside of just general foot aches and pains, tend to be all of the blisters and bunions and issues from abrasion. So obviously the best thing we can do is make sure that our shoes aren't pushing on us in different places or rubbing up against us in different ways as we're moving, because our feet are very dynamic and sometimes shoes refuse to be. But we can also look towards things like sweat as we add that to the equation, because our feet sweat a lot. We end up with added abrasion in different areas. So wearing socks, if you can, or any sort of stockings can really help with that issue, especially if you are wearing a pair of shoes for the first time and you're not sure how it's going to work. Wearing socks with them can really make a big difference, especially when you're going to try on shoes for the first time. If you're doing that in the morning, then your feet aren't necessarily going to be as swollen as when you're going to likely be wearing fancy shoes in the evening, for example. Trying things on with socks to make up that difference can really help. It can also help minimize in day-to-day wear by dealing with things like rigidity of the shoe. So one of the things you've heard me mention over and over again is the fact that shoes today are just so much more stiff and rigid than they used to be, and that causes a lot of problems because they don't move and flex. And one of the things that you can look for in shoes, depending on the type of shoe, is what it's made out of. So very often the uppers are either made out of a leather or leather substitute, or they're made out of a fabric. So some fabrics are very lightweight and very flexible, some are even knits, and you get a lot more give on those because they will mold and move with your foot. When it comes to leather and leather substitutes, however, there are some important things to know about. Leather can come as vegetable tanned or chrome tanned. Vegetable tanning is the older style of tanning and it is more expensive, so very often if shoes are using vegetable tan leather, they will advertise that fact. Most of the time you're going to see this dyed instead of painted, and in general it ends up being much more supple and flexible. So it's going to mold and move with your feet a lot more easily. If you say need to stretch it, you can simply use water, but even your own sweat is going to help with that. Chrome tan, on the other hand, is less expensive. It's a more modern process. It can be dyed or it can be painted. It can also have something that's kind of in between the two. If it's really bright, vibrant colors, it's a more solid, glassier finish to it, that's probably painted. Chrome tan is much less flexible. It's not going to mold to your feet necessarily in the same way. Especially if it's painted, it's a lot more difficult to do that. Yes, you can still stretch the shoe. It is recommended that you use an alcohol-based spray on the inside of the shoe. However, to sort of begin that stretching process, if you're using a shoe stretcher or any of the little bumps that you can put on those to help sort of ease out certain areas. So it's not going to be quite as forgiving of a leather, but it is much cheaper. When it comes to leather substitutes, those are plastic. Regardless of what terminology they want to use, vegan leather or otherwise, they are plastic. Even the vegan leathers that are mostly made up of apple or mushroom or other things like that, when it comes to shoes, will most often, I'm not going to say all the time because there's probably a few exceptions out there, but the vast majority of the time they rely on plastic to give them the stretch and the flexibility and the strength that they need. So there's usually something mixed in there, and that just simply means that they're not going to be as repairable. They're going to wear out faster and be less comfortable during the wear and tear process. Additionally, when you're looking at shoes beyond just what they're made out of, take a look at the seams and the stitching techniques. Take a look at all the different parts and pieces, because anywhere where there is stitching, it's not going to be as flexible. So if there's a bunch of stitching across the ball of the foot, it's not going to stretch as easily. Something with a cap toe, for example, is not going to stretch in the toe area as easily. So if it's a really high up cap toe and you have a lot of toe issues, that might not be as easy for you to manage and stretch that out. Same thing goes with the upper edges. If they are stitched, they're not going to stretch as easily. And seams are a big part of that, especially if they're in your problem areas. You'll also find that if you have a pair of shoes that goes up higher over the foot, you'll end up with creasing across where your foot is constantly bending, where the joint of your foot is. This creasing is perfectly normal. It's fine so long as it's not, again, on a seam or stitching that isn't going to give, that is going to buckle and pinch your foot in that area. So pay attention to where the fold is occurring. The creases aren't a big issue unless they're lining up with seams or stitching or other problems. For that matter, we also need to look at the toe box. So even if it's not visible on the outside that a toe cap goes way too far up, the toe box inside of the shoe, which might feel like it's giving you a bunch of elevation and space, can be incredibly rigid, and if it goes too far up the foot, that's going to create problems with where things are folding, creasing, and digging into your foot as well. It's also not going to give you any expansion space underneath if your toes need it. The toe box is usually made out of a thermoplastic or something in that range, so it is not going to be stretchable and flexible even if the rest of the shoe is a leather that is. Same thing goes with the heel cup. They want to retain the shape of these shoes regardless of what sort of wear and tear they go through, so they aren't deflating and buckling, so they put a lot of rigidity into it, meaning that every time you shove your foot into your shoe, the back's not going to buckle, meaning that as you bump your toe on things, it's not going to dent and deflate. So there's reasons for those to be there in terms of the overall appearance of the shoe, but they can fight back with your foot a lot, and they just aren't going to ever really give in, or for that matter, break in. Those parts of the shoe are always going to be as rigid as they are from day one. Breaking in your shoe is a valid thing if we're talking about leathers that soften up as you go. Many leathers, those chrome tans that are heavily painted, are not going to soften up a lot. They might stretch out a bit. It won't happen almost at all with plastic shoes, so it only really works with shoes that have a leather that will become softer with age, because shoes are such a very complex thing and your feet have so many needs. You're going to have to try a lot of things on until you find what works for you. But you can also do a lot of extra work to those shoes in terms of padding things out, looking through all of the options for ways to adjust your shoes with stretching or cushions, and know that it's not that your feet have problems, it's just that there's such a wide variety of feet, and there is no one right shoe for all feet. Knowing what the proportions of your foot are, knowing what areas of your foot are squishy or not, and what areas might end up constantly battling with the edges of shoes or the seams of shoes or different areas. That's what I've been able to learn with all of my years of looking at and reproducing and wearing antique styles of shoes, recognizing that things feel completely different and work for me in ways that I didn't expect. I never would have understood why my little toe was constantly getting blisters if I hadn't worn shoes that were straight last and didn't have that issue. If I hadn't worn shoes that were lighter weight in their uppers and don't give me problems with that. So now I know when I go to buy modern shoes that I need to make sure that they aren't too far canted to the interior, that I buy soft leather and knit uppers in order to accommodate that I make sure that I give certain areas space, and know that there are some shoes that will just never work for my feet, and it's not worth the amount of pain and discomfort in order to force it.